Based on the comments I see online, there seems to be a lot of confusion about the best way to plant a perennial. So in this video, I'm going to cover the whole process of planting a perennial from start to finish. Pretty much everything I'm going to discuss also applies to annuals, and most of it even applies to trees and shrubs. But I'll make a separate video for trees and shrubs because they are a little bit different. I use two different planting techniques depending on when I'm doing the planting. I prefer to do all my planting in spring and fall. I'm in zone 5 and I like to get it all done before the 1st of June or after September 1. June, July, and August is tough for plants that have been recently put in the ground. But if they're potted plants, you can plant them all summer long, provided you do it correctly. In the first part of the video, I'll show you how I plant in early spring and fall. Now, I've been experimenting growing some marijuana plants, and I'm certainly no expert on this. It's kind of a fun process to learn. It turns out that this plant is actually a male plant. Now, we don't want male plants producing pollen, so we got to get rid of the plant. So I'm going to use it as a sacrificial lamb for today's demonstration. I don't really need the top part, it's just in my way, so we'll get rid of that. So let's pretend that we just went to the nursery, we bought this plant and brought it home. The first thing I do is have a look at the potting media. Take your fingers and actually pick some of that up. What is it made of? The reason you want to do this is that almost no nursery plants in soil. They all use some sort of artificial mix. This particular plant is in compost. A lot of nursery plants will be in peat moss, or they'll be in some decomposed wood products. The problem with all of those materials is that they absorb water very differently than your soil. If we plant this the way it is, then either this part stays far too dry and our soil is wet, or this stays too wet and our soil is dry. So the fact that this is not soil is a problem, and we're going to deal with that. The second thing I do is look at the root ball. Now this root ball is not too bad. I can see some surface roots here, but not too many. But I do see a lot of roots at the bottom. Many times when you buy these in a nursery, the outside is completely covered with roots, and we call that root bound. In this case, it's starting to be root bound, but it's not too bad yet. If you have a plant that's root bound, you need to do something with those roots. If you leave them alone, they'll just keep going around and around in a circle here, and they won't go into your soil, which means the plant does not get established properly. There are two things you can do to this. A lot of people will slice off the bottom. Now that looks like you're doing a lot of damage to this plant, but it will recover, and in the long run it will be a better plant. The other thing I like to do is I make some vertical cuts through the roots. Now I only go in about a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch here. I'm not going very deep. And I make 4 cuts going around the root ball. What you're doing is slicing the roots that are going around the outside. And wherever you've made a cut, that root will respond by making side branches, and those side branches will tend to come out into your soil. So that takes care of the root bound issue. The second thing we want to do something about is that this artificial soil is just so different from our own. So what I like to do is to rough it up a bit. Especially near the top, that's important. So now what I have is a plant where the outer roots here have been damaged a little bit. The inner roots are okay, but the plant has got root damage. We have to understand that's a problem, and we'll deal with that after we plant it. So this is now ready to go in the ground. I have another male marijuana plant here, and I'm going to show you how to plant this in the middle of summer. So again, I'm taking the top off just to make it easier to handle. You wouldn't do that with your plant. So it's July and August. It's really hot out. The sun's shining all the time. That is really hard for planting in the garden. The extra sun and the extra heat makes this plant lose a lot of moisture through the leaves, which means the roots are working overtime trying to suck up enough moisture. So we can't treat this plant the way we did the first one. To be honest, I try to avoid planting in the middle of summer. And if I went to a nursery and bought a plant like this, there's a very good chance I'll just keep it in my nursery area. It's an area near the hose where I take care of potted plants. And I'll just leave it there until September and then plant it. The reason I do that is that I can keep it in the shade. That keeps it cooler. It's near the hose, so it gets watered all the time. I take better care of it in my nursery area than I would if I put it out in the garden. Now, I know a lot of gardeners don't have an area like that, and so you might as well just put it into your garden. First thing I would do is water it really well. And by water well, I mean have the hose on this for several minutes. You want this root ball completely wet. And here's one of the problems with the media they use. Things like peat moss, once they're dry, they don't re-wet very well. And so what happens a lot of time in the summer is you water this for several minutes and you walk away and think, hey, I watered my plant a lot, and then you notice it's drooping. Well, take your finger and stick it in the soil. You might find that all the water you put in here just ran down the side inside the pot and never actually soaked into the root ball. If you have that situation, take the whole thing, put it in a tub of water or a wheelbarrow and let it sit there for an hour. You've got to get this root ball really good and wet. As long as it's dry, you haven't really watered yet. So now we have a really wet root ball. You can see that this plant is a bit root bound. It's starting to make roots going around the outside. Even the bottom's a bit root bound. But I'm not going to cut these. The problem is that in the middle of summer, if I cut these, the roots can't absorb enough water to keep the plant healthy. And so what will happen is the whole top will droop and may die down. So I do as little damage to this as I can. Now I might take some of the top off because I don't want the top exposed to the air. It just loses too much moisture. So I take a ½ inch off the top. I might tease the bottom a little bit, but I do as little damage to the root system as possible. It's just too hot to take care of this root system. So this plant is now ready to go in the ground in July and August. Before I actually show you how to plant these, let's go over a couple of other questions that people ask. What about the flowers on these plants? A lot of the plants that are sold in nurseries are in full bloom. That's why you buy them. People get attracted to the flowers, they bring them home, they're covered in flowers, and now we want to plant them. But we know that planting is hard on the plant. So what do? For the health of the plant, the best thing you can do is take all those flowers off. Now I know you want to see the flowers and you probably bought it for the flowers, so you have to decide, do you want to do what's good for you or what's good for the plant? What I usually do is I take most of the flowers off and leave a couple so I can appreciate the plant. But flowers use up a lot of water, and the job for this plant is to grow roots, not to support flowers. If we plant them correctly, you'll get a better bloom next year. But for this year, it's a good idea to take those flowers off. You don't have to take the flowers off. I know most of you won't, and that's okay. The plant will survive. It's just a little harder on the plant. Another question that comes up all the time is, what kind of fertilizer should I be putting in the planting hole? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. None. Don't fertilize these plants when you put them in the ground. The soil around the plant already has the nutrients it needs, and that will feed the plant. You don't have to add extra nutrients. Adding bone meal and Epsom salts at planting time is a complete myth. If anything, the plant needs a bit of nitrogen, but your soil probably will provide lots of that. So don't fertilize when you plant. Now let me show you how I plant these. The actual planting process is the same whether you're doing this in spring or in summer. Do it exactly the same way. Step one is I'm going to dig a hole, and it doesn't have to be much bigger than the root ball. A couple extra inches all the way around, that's all you really need. The depth of the hole doesn't have to be any deeper than the root ball. In fact, you don't want loose soil down there. If I dig a deep hole and then fill it with loose soil, put my plant up here, over time the soil settles and the plant gets deeper and deeper. And we really want to plant most perennials at the same depth that they were in the pot. And that's why you don't want loose soil below the root ball. As far as adding amendments, don't. We want this plant to grow in our soil. There's no point in fooling it by putting in a bunch of peat moss or compost around it and giving it a real nice place to grow. We want those roots growing out into our soil. So this is really quite simple. Dig a hole, put the plant in, put the soil back, and you're done. So I take my plant and I place it in the hole, and I check to see where the top of the root ball is. I want the top of the root ball to be at about ground level. If the root ball is too low, take it out, put some soil back, pat it down, test it again. If it's too high, dig it a little deeper. I actually guessed pretty good on this one. I put a little bit of pressure around the outside just to settle the soil, and I want the soil from the root ball covered. I don't want to see any peat moss here because water evaporates from peat moss very quickly. So I want a thin layer of soil all over this plant. The next step is to do some watering. The common advice for watering newly planted plants is to water a lot. Now that's partially true, but people interpret it incorrectly. What it means is that when you water a lot. It does not mean water every day. If you're used to watering like this and you're done, that's not watering. I know a lot of people go through their garden every day and kind of wet the leaves, and they say, oh, I water every day, but that's really not watering. The bottom roots of this plant are a good 6 to 8 inches deep. We need to get water that deep in the soil, and that takes a while to get there. So what you want to do is water well. And I watch the surface of the soil, and when I see puddling, when I see that water starting to run away, I know I might as well stop, because all I'm doing is watering the plant over there. I'm not watering this plant. I have to allow the soil here to absorb the water. So I stop for a few seconds, let that water soak in. Once all the puddles are gone, I do it again. The puddles are starting to form, so I'll stop. Now in the regular garden, I'd go over here and water something else while I'm waiting for these puddles to soak into the soil. The other thing that's important is you don't water right here. You want to wet everything, here and out here. So you want to make a good ring around your plant. The reason for that is if you get lots of water just in the center where your plant is, the dry soil over here sucks that water away from your plant. And you actually want all the soil around here evenly wet so water isn't moving away from the plant. If anything, I want it to move towards the plant. So don't be afraid to water soil that has no plants in it around here. I repeat that process, and it'll take me a good 5 minutes to water this plant. But you want that soil good and wet. Another excellent way to water is to put this on a very low setting, so it's just dribbling out. Put the hose right on top of the plant and just let it sit there. You can go and have a coffee. Let it run like this for a half hour and you'll have watered that plant really well. What I'll then do is come back tomorrow and do it all over again. Do a good thorough watering on day 2. The whole process again. Once I've gone through that watering process, then I leave the plant. Even if it's sunny and hot out, the soil several inches deep is still wet. You don't want to water this plant every day. Roots breathe air, just like you and I. If you take our head and sink it down below the water, we drown. And roots do the same thing. People who water every day are very likely to kill the root. And once the roots are damaged, the whole top of the plant droops. A drooping plant does not mean you have to water. If you want to know if it's time to water, take your finger and feel the soil, especially the root ball. It's not so important out here, but the root ball has to be good and wet. Stick your finger in that root ball. If you feel moisture, you don't have to water. If that root ball is dry, even if the soil around it is wet, you have to water. You have to get that root ball wet. If you're doing this in spring and fall, you probably only have to water every 3-4 days for the first couple weeks. And after that, you do it maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. For newly planted things, it's a good idea to water regularly for the first year. After that, they should be established and they're on their own, and then you just water them along with all the other plants. Let's say you're doing this in July and August. How does that change the watering? Well, a lot of people go outside and they think, oh, it's so hot out here. I have to drink lots of liquids, so I have to water my plants a lot. And that's not necessarily true. It is true that water evaporates faster at higher temperatures, but in a lot of places when it's hot, it's also humid, and that slows down the evaporation. You don't have to water any more in hot weather. You should water based on the soil. If it's wet, don't water. If the soil starts drying out, you have to water. Now, newly planted things do tend to droop a little more, especially if you've damaged the roots. And even if you've been gentle, you can pretty much assume you've done some root damage. So expect a little bit of drooping. The solution to that is not to water immediately. The solution is to wait and let the plant recover itself. Now, what I would do with this plant is after I've watered it really good, I like mulching it, so I'd surround it with wood chips, good 3 inches. The wood chips do a couple things. Keeps the soil cooler, which roots like, and it slows down water evaporation. This is my garden, Aspen Grove, and I grow about 3,000 different kinds of plants, and many of them are perennials. Here are some pictures of just a few of them. The method I've shown you today is the same method I've used for all of these plants. If you'd like to learn more garden secrets, why don't you join our Facebook group called Garden Fundamentals? Or have a look at some more of my videos, and I'll put a link to those in the top right-hand corner. Have a great day in the garden.